This final fight scene was one of your favorite moments from the episode. Could you tell us about that?
It was cool. That's all I have to say.
And we're done.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for listening. Stay classy.
Good night, folks.
Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. It's the 4th episode of Breakfast in Beauclair Season 2, and I feel properly back in the swing of things after the 3-month break. I'm back at the podcast schedule. I received our new breakfast-themed merch from Emily at Morrison Norris, a beautiful handmade tea towel set with the black and speckled chickens from the Beauclair Palace kitchens, and a print inspired by traditional Polish paper-cutting crafts. And now that we're back in the flow, we have new friends to welcome to the company. I'm excited to introduce James of Cintra and Wes, who've become the newest patrons of the show. We also have a massive class of new producer-level patrons, so let's extend a welcome to Louis, like Vuitton, the original Roach, Ariel Kitty, the one true chef, Dustin, and existing patrons Red Kite and Charlotte from Edinburgh Glamorai, who upgraded their pledges to producer-level patronage. They join our existing producer-level patrons, Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric's the Godling, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B., Julie, Sylvia of Skellige, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, The Haven of the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, and Sebastian von Novigrad. As producer-level patrons, they receive an introduction shout-out, a spot on the website, bonus content this Saturday after every episode, stickers, exclusive producer gifts from partner Emily at Morrison Norris, and producer credits in each and every episode. If you'd like to explore becoming a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Rob P. from New York and Mitch from Nebraska join us for the first half of episode 103, Betrayer Moon from Netflix's The Witcher. Join us for a conversation about post-production work in the film industry, the horror influences and atmosphere in this episode, analyzing the storytelling and conflict through an editing and screenwriting lens, teenage dreams, and the freelance gig economy in Temeria for Witchers and workers of the self-described variety. In our mid-episode news segment, Tidings from Toussaint, Larson Witcher Flicks launches Henry Cavill Power Hour with tidbits from some of the actors' recent interviews, as well as additional insights into Season 2 from showrunner Lauren S. Hissrich. Without further ado, let's get to the discussion of The Witcher Episode 103, Betrayer Moon Part 1. Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and joining us today are Rob from New York and Mitch from Nebraska. We have the wonderful opportunity to talk to someone who's studying film and also someone who's working as a professional in the film industry as well. Mitch, you're currently studying film in Nebraska. Could you tell us about how you decided to pursue film in your studies?
Yeah. When I was like a little kid, I didn't really have the understanding that television was like made by people. And so I thought television was like a screen into another world. And so I really wanted to step into that world. You know, as I grew up, I got into movies a lot, and I applied to the film school here in Nebraska. Johnny Carson's funded a great film school down in here in the Midwest, and doing pretty well here. I'm a junior now, even though I think when this comes out, I will no longer be a junior. Yeah, because I think this is coming out in the summer, right? Yeah.
It will come out in summer. It's only February.
Yeah.
It's Valentine's Day weekend.
Yeah. In the summer, I won't be a junior. I will be going into my senior year. And, you know, like before I was going into college, I kind of wanted to just get into the industry without any college experience. But I've really enjoyed college. This experience showed me a lot about who I am as a person. And you know, I've kind of also learned about like what aspects of filmmaking I really like.
For anyone that might be interested in, let's say, pursuing education in film or entertainment, what kind of tracks are available to you as a student, and ultimately, why did you decide to pursue the one that you pursued?
What always brought me in about filmmaking in general is the storytelling. Screenwriting appeals to me the most because it appeals to my want to create stories in my favorite medium, which is film and television. And that's why I love television so much, and this is why I was so excited for The Witcher. You know, television is like kind of a great combination of film and novels because it can actually has time to focus on character. That's why I think the Witcher novels are so successful, is because you love every single character that they introduce. That's what I really enjoy about screenwriting, and especially like teleplay writing, is that you can really delve into these more personal matters. So I get much more connected to the characters.
I know that you mentioned that it's February, but by the time this episode releases, it'll be sometime in summer. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going to happen during your program during that last year?
I still have the opportunity to either create a capstone film or write a screenplay. I think I definitely want to go down the feature film screenplay route. Writing a screenplay would probably be more down the line of like what I want to do, and I think it'd be great for me to graduate from school.
So, Rob, you're currently working as a freelance editor, assistant editor, and screenwriter, and you're currently here in New York as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this aspect of the industry?
Sure. Similar to Mitch, I went to film school at NYU Tisch, specifically their film and TV production undergraduate program. And I specialized in screenwriting and documentary filmmaking and editing. So I got into filmmaking, specifically editing, when I was 15 as a kind of coping mechanism to kind of deal with, unfortunately, the suicide of my father. I just kind of discovered editing while I was kind of in this weird funk of not really knowing what I wanted to do in my life and not really knowing where my life was going to go. And from then on, since the age of 15, 16, I've been editing my own YouTube videos, short films, feature films. I've been working as an assistant editor since I graduated NYU on documentaries, independent features. I've worked as a post-production assistant on some bigger blockbusters like Ready Player One. Yeah, I've worked entirely in New York City. So I've been living in New York City for 8.5 years. I'm lucky enough to have been able to have a sustainable career as a freelance assistant editor since then. And then on the side, I've been writing feature-length screenplays, working on a TV pilot, and I've been writing my first novel, which I'm on my 5th or 6th draft of right now. You know, it's a combination of working on other people's projects and then working on my own projects so I keep myself creatively invigorated and not be stagnant. Because I think it's very easy when you're a freelancer to kind of just go from job to job and be worried about working paycheck to paycheck. And sometimes you forget to work on your own stuff. And I always try to remember that I have my own artistic voice, and it's important to be able to express that when I can't do that working on other people's projects a lot of the time.
Something that I think would be really interesting to go into, especially again for people who may be interested in pursuing film or just learning more about the industry. So you did mention that you're a freelancer. What are some other opportunities that might be part of the market or industry that editors could pursue?
There's a lot of ways to break into the industry. Everyone has a different story. You know, if you want to be a freelancer like me, the big thing is to start out as usually a post-production assistant on a film, and let people know that you want to be an editor, or maybe you work as a post-production assistant and you realize that you'd rather be a post-production coordinator or a post-production supervisor. That's a big thing to really think about when you're choosing kind of entry-level jobs. What is this job going to offer you? What are you going to offer in return to the people that are hiring you? And then ultimately, what do you want your career goals to be a year, 5 years, 10 years from this job, you know? And letting people know that you're interested in editing or you're interested in being a coordinator or supervisor for a team of post people, either working on a film or in a facility. They are both great ways to meet people, learn, start building your network, and then hopefully start figuring out what you want to do, what you don't want to do in the industry. And maybe you don't want to be in the industry. You know, that's a perfectly reasonable thing because it's a tough industry. There's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of failure. There's a lot of times where you'll be let go of jobs, and sometimes it's not even your fault. There's a lot of obstacles to overcome sometimes in terms of maintaining a career. So that's all good things to keep in mind. But if you wake up in the morning and there's nothing else that you would rather do then work in the film industry or work as an editor or an assistant editor, whatever part of post-production or production you want to work in, that means that you've realized that you want to be a part of the film industry.
Today, we'll be discussing Betrayer Moon, the third episode in Netflix's first season of The Witcher. This episode primarily focuses on Geralt and Yennefer. In Geralt's timeline, it adapts Sapkowski's original short story, The Witcher, which was written in 1986 for a contest in Fantastica, Poland's leading science fiction and fantasy literary magazine. Betrayer Moon also continues the show's original plotline for Yennefer, following her origins at Aretuza, the continent's magical academy for girls. At the end, a brief scene with Ciri, the fleeing Cintran princess, sets up her arc for the following episode of Banquets, Bastards, and Burials. In this episode, the Witcher journeys to Temeria, where he attempts to cure the kingdom of its Striga attacks by turning the monster back into their princess and the sole heir to their throne. The opening of Geralt's storyline starts with actually a different Witcher in Temeria learning about the Striga attack from an injured boy who eventually dies. He goes to, hunt for the creature and is ultimately killed. These are the two scenes that set up Geralt's arc throughout this story.
What I love about this opening is that it starts with audio under black, and then it fades up and you just see this really wonderful close-up shot of his kind of pained face. There's a little bit of movement, and the way that he's lit, the music that's coming in, and the tale of this monster that he's recounting, it immediately establishes this really great, very uncomfortable horror atmosphere.
Yeah, it's very clear that director Alex Garcia Lopez, it's very clear that he's a big horror fan. He may even be a fan of Brian De Palma films with Carrie, and that becomes very clear at the end of the episode.
Yeah, and Alex Garcia Lopez had directed episodes of Daredevil, also for Netflix, and he had directed episodes of the dark thriller series Utopia.
I think he did The Punisher as well.
Yes, he's directed a lot of stuff for Netflix and a lot of really wonderful TV episodes. This episode was also written by Bo DeMeo, who's also writing the animated Witcher film, which, just based on the title alone, Nightmare of the Wolf, it also sounds like it's going to be horror-themed. And the director of photography for this episode is Jean-Philippe Gossart, who shot episodes of Into the Badlands and also the horror Amazon series Lore. And then this episode was edited by Nick Arthurs, who edited episodes of Doctor Who, The Alienist, also an adaptation, and His Dark Materials, also a fantasy adaptation. So you can clearly tell from this opening sequence, which immediately establishes this horror atmosphere, that this episode is going to be different from the previous two that have come before. The way that it's cut, the pacing of this opening sequence, it really gets you in the mood, but then it also shows you for the first time that there are other Witchers in this world. The way that it's cut with just kind of this Witcher standing in the shadows and a close-up of his medallion, that we think that this is Geralt, and then of course he steps out of the shadows and it's a different Witcher who is immediately, we can tell, a bit different from Geralt because he immediately demands 3,000 orens. By the time that this caretaker of this dying boy has handed them over, the poor boy is revealed to have these massive cuts in his chest. What's so great about the sequence, and just purely in terms of editing, is how it doles out information bit by bit. It doesn't throw everything right at you immediately. It kind of slowly builds this atmosphere and builds out each of these characters, I think, really cleverly. Leading up to then the sequence where the Witcher tracks this creature that has killed this boy. In my opinion, it was a great homage to films like Alien and Jaws, where there's a lot of tension in terms of the camera movement and the framing of the shots. It's a kind of cutting between POV shots and shots of the Witcher just kind of creeping through this meat freezer. It's this really great tense atmosphere that's reminiscent of creature features from the 70s. With the sound design and the music. It's a really great, really atmospheric opening sequence that then leads us into finding what Geralt's doing.
Yeah, it's a really great setup for the episode because I feel like this episode's kind of emulating the classic TV arc of Monster of the Week.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's literally a monster and it's one episode. But, you were set up as this Witcher who's been tasked to kill this monster. And Witchers, as we know, are professional monster hunters, so we know that they're very good at this. And this monster kills this Witcher easily. And so it sets up the episode really well because we're only led to believe like, oh, Geralt's going to have to kill this monster somehow. And we know that this monster is very capable of killing him extremely easily because it can kill somebody at least equal to him.
Yeah, it definitely sets up not just the premise of the episode, but also the stakes. Ultimately, we do have 5 more episodes to go, but like it does set up like the expectations that this is going to be a difficult confrontation.
Yeah, man, even if Geralt doesn't get killed, there's definitely tension in terms of how is he going to stop this creature that's clearly capable of doing really horrendous things.
Right. In the upward arc of Geralt's storyline, he learns about the monster that's terrorizing Temeria. His call to action in this episode actually begins with a whore that he's betting in the opening scenes for Geralt. She's the one who incentivizes him to go to Temeria. He then is introduced to Triss Merigold, who's serving as advisor to King Foltest, as well as some of King Foltest's advisors, Segolin and Ostrit. Segolin seems to be the captain of his guard, and Ostrit is a magnate, according to the books. So he is someone in a position of power. And throughout the beginnings of the episode, we're getting introduced to what's terrorizing Temeria.
Right in the beginning of the episode when he's, I'm going to call her, she's a sex worker, right?
Yes.
She's a self-described whore, but yeah, she's a sex worker.
Yeah, when he's with the self-described whore. What I think that scene does well is that it establishes like how Jaskier has affected his life because she's singing all of his ballads, and it's showing that Geralt has like gained some fame in between the second episode and the third episode. She knows like his adventures, and she's like pointing out his scars, like showing like what monsters she got them from. It shows throughout the story that he is kind of known for his heroic feats now.
That's an idea that really came up in the last episode, episode 2, which had the adaptation of The Edge of the World, which is the first time that Jaskier and Geralt meet, and the episode in which Toss a Coin to Your Witcher appears. We're starting to see like the creation of this infamous Witcher persona.
The myth of Geralt.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah,
and it kind of shows that he doesn't really like this persona that's been created for him because she's like pointing out all these scars in him, and I don't think he really likes being remembered for his heroic deeds. I think he doesn't really appreciate the fame. He kind of just wants to go unnoticed, do his job, make money, and live in peace. But, this stupid bard has changed his plans.
I think what's kind of notable for me is that it's not something you see a lot. Depictions of sex work in general in fiction. He hands over the money and he says thank you for everything after, she gives him the lowdown on this past Witcher that kind of came through town. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of like, oh, that's a nice little detail to show that he actually kind of respects her profession. Yeah. He's kind of a bit more mature. It's kind of one freelancer to another. So I like that little detail. It's good character building from episode to episode and makes Geralt likable.
Yeah, and it also sets up that he may be a little lonely.
For sure.
Exactly.
This will come back later in the episode because people always say that he's, devout of motion. Mm-hmm. So this kind of sets up how he feels about himself at that particular moment.
Right. I think the other thing that we see is we have these grand moments of fights, of action sequences. We get to see him work, but there's very few moments and we just see the banality of his everyday living, which, does seem like staying in an inn for 3 days with a sex worker. It sets up a baseline foundation for what we expect of him as a character, at least in the beginning, and then also seeing how different kinds of relationships change his independent routine.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, that leads into the moment when we get a little bit more Roach interaction, when he kind of has to give up Roach's collateral to the tavern owner. And we get this fun little sequence where both men are trying to intimidate each other, which then leads to the title card for the episode.
Yeah. From here on out, this is where we're getting the meat of exposition and the premise of why Geralt is now in Temeria. From the sex worker, we do learn that this is a problem that's plaguing Temeria as a whole. Not just the king and not just the upper class, but this is really severely impacting lower class workers, such as miners. And this is the family of the boy in the beginning of the episode, So a few moments of exposition that we learn about this, as you had said earlier, Rob, when we see these miners, these workers, talking about how this problem is now manifesting in multiple ways, and then they ultimately decide, like, we should overthrow our king. And then that is then stopped by Ostrit, who's a magnate. And then eventually, Geralt injects himself into the situation. He's then sent away by Ostrit, but then brought back in by Triss Merigold, who's a sorceress, and then she gives him additional exposition. Eventually, he's brought before the king, who gives him more exposition. So we're kind of getting multiple layers of the issue.
Yeah, and it should be noted that Triss works as the sorceress for Foltest.
On the command of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers.
Exactly. This is, I believe, the first episode where that whole concept is broached in terms of Yen's storyline. Once we get into Yen's storyline, we kind of get into a bit more of the politics of the Brotherhood and how sorcerers and sorceresses are assigned to different kings and queens around the continent. Triss is kind of the peaceful approach to resolving this conflict with the Striga, whereas the miners kind of represent the more violent approach. By introducing the miners, the king's advisors, and then Triss, in a lot of ways, it's taking a lot of inspiration, not just from Monster of the Week episodes from TV shows like X-Files, but it's also seemingly taking inspiration from the really great side quests from the Witcher video games as well. I think structurally, this whole episode feels something like the Bloody Baron side quest from The Witcher 3, where there are multiple options for Geralt to take. And as the situation unravels, things get more and more complicated.
I mean, from reading about these episodes online, I think that's why people connected to this episode the most, especially people who played the games primarily, because it felt most like the video game to me. I was actually talking with my friends about this show, and he said, this is one of the only episodes where you see Geralt actually doing his job. So I think that's why so many people have connected with it.
Yeah. We can specifically outline 3 different approaches to this problem. As you said, Rob, the first is a more peaceful approach, a curing approach somehow with Triss that'll turn this monster back into this princess. The violent approach through both Seglin and Ostrit seems to kill it somehow, and then Foltest actually just is completely inactive and does nothing, which is what angers the miners so much. There's peaceful activity, violent activity, and then just complete inactivity.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it neutral. It's just, you just don't care.
Yeah, which is kind of why we have so much animosity flowing down the ranks of not just the other people in the upper classes, but also flowing all the way down to people such as the miners that we meet. When we actually start to see Geralt's work, he does partner with Triss through this whole sleuthing throughout the episode. When he actually starts to work, Triss catches him outside of the old palace. They chase the guards away, and the two of them enter the palace and start snooping around. Ultimately, they discover letters that reveal that Foltest, the king, had an ancestral relationship with Ada, his sister. This is how we found out that this Striga was born from a curse, specifically. Someone was really unhappy with their ancestral relationship. Ultimately, Geralt and Triss then question Ostrit, the magnate, who we've seen kind of throughout the episode as Foltest's advisor, and we discover that he attempted to curse Foltest, but ultimately cursed Ada's child.
Yeah, and the scene where Geralt and Triss are walking through the abandoned section of the castle, there's a scene where they pass by an old, weathered portrait of Foltest and Ada as children. That is the moment where Geralt reveals that he thinks Foltest is the father of the Striga. And that portrait obviously will come back later once we get further into Yen's storyline. And I think what this episode does really well is it gives the audience enough clues in terms of setting up and paying things off within the episode, in terms of establishing how far apart Geralt and Yen's storylines are, I think, for the first time this season.
I mean, really, it's basically this whole thing is just an investigation. And I feel like I can talk about this when we talk about how it differs from the book. Because it's all this information is revealed gradually. Well, in the book, it's just kind of revealed at one time. And there's really no suspense or shock value when all of this is revealed.
Once Geralt and Triss have gathered as much information as they possibly can through both the exposition earlier in the episode as well as through their exploration of the old palace, Geralt comes back later, prepared to fight the Striga. By the time he arrives at the old palace, Foltest is already there with some of his guard. We see a very strong callback to the events of episode 1, where Geralt killed Renfri. This is something that we'll see throughout the season as a whole, but choosing the lesser evil is something that continually informs the way that Geralt makes decisions, and we will see that here. Part of the reason why he seems to want to help Foltest and to find a cure for this princess is because he feels some sort of penance for how he handled the situation with Renfri. Geralt enters the old palace. He has Ostrit in there in Ada's old bed. It's revealed that Ostrit was the one who cursed Foltest and Ada, and Geralt uses him as bait for the Striga, and then a fight ensues.
So that scene with Foltest in the bridge, I think it's a great little moment for both him and Geralt because, when we're first introduced to Foltest, he's eating like a big old chicken leg or turkey leg, and it's kind of gross.
It's extremely grotesque.
Yeah, and then later it's revealed that he thinks that Geralt doesn't have any emotions, which is obviously false, but once he's talking to Geralt, he says that he envies Geralt because Geralt doesn't have the capability of feeling love, which I think kind of hits Geralt a little bit because he very much obviously can. I think it kind of foreshadows future events in the show. His relationship with Yennefer, the people that are important to him, and he loves very much. He just doesn't have very many people important to him right now, so that might also be why he's doing this for Renfri, because this was a person he connected with, and he ultimately had to kill her, so it's kind of like he killed one of the only people in his life that was actually important to him. It may seem as a way of him reconnecting with something that he might have lost.
And, what's so great about that scene on the bridge with Foltest and Geralt is that it humanizes both characters because, Foltest goes from kind of being this stereotypical king to more of a weirdly tragic figure. Kind of similar, once again, to the Bloody Baron in Witcher 3. The audience's view of Foltest kind of shifts throughout the whole episode, up to the moment where he's on the bridge and he's kind of having this heart-to-heart with Geralt. What's so interesting is that, like you said, Mitch, he assumes that Geralt doesn't have emotions, he can't feel love. And what's so interesting to me, and I think what makes Geralt such an interesting character, is that he doesn't correct Foltest on this assumption. He kind of gives him this kind of stare, this look of apprehension, but he doesn't really correct him. He kind of lets him have this assumption. And I think that's so interesting that Geralt is someone that very clearly keeps his emotions close to his chest, and he keeps this kind of image that a lot of people have of Witchers and doesn't try to change it. I think that's what makes him such an interesting protagonist, is that he knows he's a more complicated person than people assume, but he doesn't seemingly want the public perception of Witchers to be anything other than what he thinks would ultimately benefit him the most. And in this case, having kings and rulers assume that he's this kind of emotionless, one-note kind of killing machine. I thought that was such a great moment that Henry Cavill played opposite Sean Dooley, the actor who played Foltest.
One of the things that we know about Henry Cavill's take on Geralt is that when he and showrunner Lauren Hissrich were on set together, apparently they actually pared down the script as they were on set. Part of that is because of Henry's intimate knowledge of the character before the show was even really cast. Supposedly they did cut back on a lot of his dialogue as well. So the huge bouts of monologues and insight into Geralt's thinking that we get in the books, ultimately we just don't get that explicitly in the screenplay. We just have to kind of read it from his body language and from his acting. I think that's really the beautiful thing about seeing this on screen, I think, is not just what they're saying explicitly, but we have the added dimension of what they're not saying, which is really nice in moments like this where you kind of see the contrast of Foltest monologuing to fill the silence and then Geralt just not saying anything at all.
Yeah, he does.
And it's so interesting because in the books, from what I know, is that Geralt talks a lot, right? But I think it still works in a visual medium. And this can be something that we talk more in talking about adapting a short story to the screen. But I think what's so great about this scene and, a lot of the scenes throughout the entire show is that Henry Cavill is such a good actor, and you can tell that he clearly understands the character of Geralt so intimately. He can do what in the books Geralt did with a paragraph-long monologue. He can do that with one look or one line of dialogue. And I think that's the mark of a really good actor, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's the big difference between novels and television and film, is that subtext is drawn very differently. So like in a book, like subtext can just be flat out told to you. Well, I think a really great thing about films, when you're watching something, like subtext of a character really isn't told to you directly. A great thing about being a viewer of a film is that your task is to kind of figure out what their subtext is. And I think Geralt is a great study for that very purpose, is because he went more with the game approach where he doesn't talk a whole lot. So you really have to delve into how he's looking at people, how Henry Cavill's acting, and how his performance is informing his thoughts and emotions. Sometimes people pick up on this subconsciously. They're not even thinking about it like academically. So when they're watching it, they kind of understand how he's feeling without even consciously processing it.
The bit of dialogue here on the bridge that really exemplifies this idea, Geralt tells Foltest, in regards to the Striga, Foltest's daughter, "This isn't my first time trying to save a princess who others see as a monster." Foltest then asks, "What happened to that princess?" And Geralt just says flatly, "I killed her." The dialogue there is so sparse and it's so straightforward that he only limits what he says to what Foltest needs to know. But the amount of, I think, honesty, forwardness, and vulnerability that even those short few phrases contain, I think says a lot about his character, coupled with what Henry Cavill is able to bring on screen in terms of subtext, acting, tone of voice, and his body language.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always about less is more, I think, when it comes to dialogue, especially in fantasy. The big thing about a new fantasy story that you're introducing to a wide audience is how much exposition do you give versus how much normal character dialogue do you give when telling a story. And it can be a difficult thing, balancing that out. And, there can be arguments that maybe The Witcher wasn't totally successful the first season in that regard, but I think at its best moments, I think it balances the expository language of fantasy with the real human emotion of all good dramas, all good stories. And I think just this little scene between two characters, I think, is a really great example of the show, I think, really nailing that balance.
At this point, Geralt gives Foltest Renfrey's brooch, saying that it's going to be a gift for the princess if he's successful. And Foltest assumes that this is because Geralt thinks that he's going to die, so he's giving Foltest the brooch before he walks in. We'll talk about the fight scene in much more detail toward the end of the episode, but at this point, Geralt enters the old palace. He uses Ostrit as bait to bring the Striga out, and then he spends the rest of the night fighting the Striga. Ultimately, he's able to put himself in her crypt, keep her out until the morning, and this is what transforms her back into a human girl. Foltest's daughter in her human form, and Geralt, without the help of his Witcher potions, have a small brawl at the end of the fight, which leaves them both bleeding profusely. Geralt faints. He's then awoken in the care of Triss Merigold, and she recaps kind of everything that has happened.
It's good that we get that final scene because it kind of gives us a nice little capstone on the beginning of the episode where Geralt was in bed with the sex worker, and now he's kind of in bed again, being nursed by Triss. He really kind of sums up his whole life attitude in this scene to Triss and allows himself to be a bit more vulnerable. And it kind of also shows that around women, especially, Geralt tends to allow himself to be more vulnerable, to open up a little bit more than he would around men. And I thought that was really interesting in the way the kind of the structure of the episode starts and ends with him in bed. Obviously, he's gone on this journey in between, but it's interesting that he starts in bed with a woman and he kind of ends in bed being nurtured by a woman.
And it does come full circle on, as you said, Geralt's approach to his lifestyle. This is where we get this little piece of dialogue that we saw in the trailer. Triss asks, "Is that all life is to you, monsters and money?" And Geralt responds, "That's all it needs to be." Definitely kind of a nice little neat bow on that Monster of the Week approach. I know, Mitch, you were going to go really into detail on this fight scene, but did you have any, thoughts on the close of Geralt's storyline in this episode?
They do this with Renfri in the first episode, where they set up that he has a destiny. And Triss also sort of alludes to he may have somebody out there for him. I mean, the show's kind of showing that it's Ciri that they're referencing, but the show might also be alluding to Yennefer as well, because at this point in his life, Geralt really hasn't found anybody except for Vesemir that's really important to him. I mean, at the beginning of the episode, he's pretty much gonna kill this Strigus so he can get his horse back. He doesn't really have anybody for himself or to support him. I mean, Jaskier's there, but he's not going to accept Jaskier. He doesn't even do it at the end of the season. So,
and he's not in this episode. So aside from, meeting Triss for the first time and them kind of forming this Scooby-Doo mystery machine, we really don't see him in the context of anybody. Yeah, I don't know how to describe it other than it just feels very Monster of the Week. It feels very routine for Geralt.
Yeah, and the way he reacts to the situation is pretty interesting, because it's Triss kind of makes it seem oh, this is a big deal. You just saved the princess, the king's really happy, they're building a statue for Nostrit, but Geralt's just yeah, that was just another day in the job. I do this all the time. I just want to take the money and leave. I don't really care about the fanfare.
It's very detective, noir type story ending. The truth of what actually happened, that's only ever really going to be known between a few people. Everything else is going to be covered up, and, Geralt is very much like a fantasy detective in a lot of ways, in the fact that he does a lot of investigating and is very world-weary, and he's witty, has a dark sense of humor. He's very similar to characters like Philip Marlowe and kind of your classic noir detectives almost, except he has a huge sword that he kills monsters with instead of a gun.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to why Sapkowski even started writing the whole thing, is because I know he got a degree in business, so it seems like he's a practical business guy. He wanted to be well, if there was a world of dangerous monsters that had to be killed, there'd be a person who'd be a professional who would do that. And so that's Geralt's job. For Geralt, it's just well, it's just another monster I'm getting rid of, so.
Exactly. Geralt would thrive in today's gig economy, for sure.
One of the last things we get here is that we come to a close on Renfri again. Triss mentions that Geralt had been continually calling out Renfri's name in his sleep, and then she ultimately gives him back the brooch that he gave to Foltest. How it got into her possession is unknown. When they were on the bridge, Foltest assumed that Geralt was giving it to him because he thought he was going to die. Maybe Foltest gave it back because Geralt didn't die, or maybe Triss knew that it was of importance to Geralt, so she took it and gave it back. But yeah, so Renfri is very present in his motivations and choices throughout the entire episode.
Which is, I think, a good thing, because it continues the arc of the season, which is Geralt realizing his destiny and what's the purpose of his life. Geralt doesn't strike me as a religious man, but I'm sure he believes in something bigger than himself, and he kind of struggles with that. And I feel like everything with Renfri that gets set up from episode 1 and continues on throughout the whole season, I think is kind of meant to really show his kind of continuing internal emotional conflict of who is Geralt? Who am I? And is this my life? Is my life just going around killing monsters as a bounty hunter and just kind of living day by day? Or do I have a greater purpose? So I guess then that would lead us to Yen's storyline.
Absolutely. Before we get to Yennefer and Ciri's storylines, we're going to hand it over to Lars from Winterflix for recent news on the Netflix show. When we come back, Rob, Mitch, and I will continue our discussion of Betrayer Moon.
Hey, it's Lars from Witcherflix, and this is Tidings from Toussaint. Welcome back, everybody. There's some cool interviews to talk about, so let's dive right into it. In an interview for Variety, Henry Cavill talked about how he came up with Geralt's voice. This is what he had to say. It didn't feel quite right to me to use his normal voice. Almost accidentally, the final Geralt voice started coming out in a scene, and I finished the scene and I thought, I really liked that scene. It felt really good. I was watching the rushes later and I thought, oh no, I did a voice for that whole scene. And so I went to Alex Garcia-Lopez, the director of the episode, and Lauren Hisrick, the showrunner, and said, look, I've done this thing. I know we've shot some stuff already without it, but I really like it and I think it really brings something. And they said, well, let's go with it. Henry Cavill also sat down with VanityFair.com for another interview about his experiences on the set of Season 1 of The Witcher. First, he talked about his costume and Geralt's gritty looks. He said, "The costumers were, towards the end, quite horrified with me. Before takes, I would look at myself and say, 'We need more dirt on me.' They'd come up to me with this tiny little it's like a pair of tights rolled up into a ball with some dust in, and they'd sort of pat it on me, and I'd say, 'Yeah guys, that's not enough.' So I'd go stand out in the rain. Sometimes I'd roll around in puddles. I would just try and get as much of the world on me so this character looked like he had lived within it." Henry also talked about using contacts for Geralt's cat's eyes. "I didn't really have a problem with them at the beginning. But when we went to the Canary Islands, there was lots of very fine volcanic dust flying about in the air, and my eyes were getting more and more sore. When we went back to Budapest, my eye technician took me in to have my eyes checked. It turned out that whatever the dust was, volcanic, it ended up scratching my eye, because it got behind the contacts and was just rubbing there for however long. It took about, I want to say, 3 weeks to heal, and then the contacts were back in." Moreover, Henry talked about the fans' reactions to him playing Geralt. "I'm very happy that people like the character so much. I know that there are mixed opinions out there as well, which I really thrive upon reading as well. For me, it's vital to go about and read. I'm on all the Reddit forums. I'm reading all the reviews. I'm literally trying to get everyone's information. Some of it is not useful, and other criticisms are incredibly useful. I take it all in, and I look forward to bringing it even closer and closer to Sapkowski's writing. So guys, be careful what you're writing on the internet. Henry might read it." In an interview for TVGuide.com, showrunner Lauren Hiswick teased what we can expect from Season 2 of The Witcher. "It's nothing substantially new, but it's interesting nevertheless." Lauren said, "Moving into Season 2, what's interesting is our storylines start to become a little bit more cohesive. The characters start overlapping a lot more. But it's been really important to us to continue exactly what you brought up, those different genres and different tones within the show. Though there's still a lot of really dark humor and some ridiculously silly humor. There's obviously romance. Geralt and Yennefer are at the forefront of it. But I think now we have this additional layer of family. There's a new emotional layer to the show, which is what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a child, and what it means to sort of realize that you need people. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of Season 2. Anyway, guys, that's it for me for today. I hope you all stay safe and well. We talk again in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Until then, thanks again for listening and good luck on the path.
Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. I'm here with Rob and Mitch discussing Betrayer Moon from Season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher. When we left off, we discussed the adaptation of The Witcher short story and Geralt's timeline, and now we'll jump into Yennefer and Ciri's. In Yennefer's storyline, Yennefer, nearing completion of her education at Aretuza, takes control of her future from those who would prefer to see her as their pawn. Yennefer here goes on this huge journey through the second half of her education. In episode 2, we saw the true origin of how she ended up discovering her magical capabilities, but it really is in this episode that we kind of see the close of that education before she then sets off into the rest of the world. In the opening scenes of Yennefer's storyline, we hear her talk about her future, first with Istredd and then with Tissaia. With Istredd, they start to kind of plan their futures together and what that might look like for them. And then with Tissaia, we see Yennefer go through a consultation for her enhancements, the enhancements that are ultimately going to make her, quote unquote, more beautiful and presentable for court. She plans to go back to Aedirn, her home kingdom, and serve the king there. These opening scenes, Yennefer with Istredd and Yennefer with Tissaia, it makes it clear the amount of character development that has happened since episode 2. And we kind of see where their relationships have ended up, and that Yennefer's relationship with Istredd has become sexual and romantic, and Yennefer's relationship with Tissaia does ultimately end up being one of mutual respect at this point in time.
Yeah, I looked up online because Netflix released that really cool timeline map thing.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, so it's been 4 years since she's entered Aretuza. She's learned a lot of magic. And I feel like that, that audience sex scene, it's kind of silly.
It's great.
I think it's kind of a funny choice, but I think it's there to show that she can, make like illusions and make like actual people. She has like that magical capability now.
Yeah, and just the way it's shot, that whole sex scene, the way it's shot, it was just a lot of close-ups, of Yen and Istrid, and a couple of wide shots, and you kind of see this just like eerily smiling audience of people just watching them, and you get a couple close-ups of Istrid just looking at them, and he's like very uncomfortable, and Yen is just like not looking at them at all, and just like playing to the audience, and it's just like this really funny but also awkward sex scene that you don't typically see in fantasy shows, because it actually builds character and pushes the story forward, and the characters are both clearly enjoying themselves, but it's also building character. I really liked that scene a lot. I really liked it a lot.
Yeah, I think it's fun because it's like, I kind of think it's fun when sex scenes are kind of funny, because it's like, yeah, usually they are, especially in Game of Thrones, it's like seen as like more like gratuitous or something, but like this is, I don't know, I think this was very tastefully done.
It took me a while to realize that it was an illusion, and I'm sure that that was intentional on production's part. Mm-hmm. I was just like, is this some sort of like ritual? Is this something that they're taking away her virginity? Like,
it's like Midsommar, yeah.
Yeah, it was really unclear as to like the purpose for why all these people were there, until you realize like, oh, they just disappeared. It's an illusion. She made them do that. The applause was a nice touch, as Istrid says. As you said, it kind of like serves as a developmental place marker for where Yennefer is now. How confident she is, not just with Istrid and Tissaia and in the context of other characters, but she seems to have a lot more confidence and self-assurance. Between her two conversations, she very clearly has her life mapped out. So we learn from her conversation with Istrid, Tissaia, that she expects to go to court and that she wants to go to court in Aedirn, and this is all set. This assurance is what sets up the conflict. We get a scene with the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, which includes mages such as Tissaia herself. It includes Stregobor, who we met all the way in episode 1 in Geralt's storyline with Renfrey, who is also the rector at Banard, which is the magical school for boys. It includes people such as Fringilla's uncle, who's also on the board as well. For reasons of state, the Brotherhood overrules Tissaia and Tissaia's decision to send Yennefer back to her home country of Aedirn and instead send her to Nilfgaard. This change in her life plan is again what kind of triggers the rest of the conflict in the episode. The reason for this is Yennefer's elven blood. So even though she is from Aedirn, the king of Aedirn prefers mages from his own kingdom. Aedirn has a political alliance with Cintra, and Cintra hates mages and elves. This is what kind of boots Yennefer out of Aedirn. In the scenes that follow, Yennefer finds out that she's no longer going back home. She's expected to go to Nilfgaard. She then confronts Tissaia, who ultimately tells her that it wasn't her that told the council about her elven blood. It was Stregobor and therefore Istrid. We see the collapse of Yennefer's trust in like the system, in her circle of friends and confidants.
Yeah, I think this is the first time that we kind of get a sense of the political machinations of the world of the continent, and specifically the Brotherhood. I love how the initial shot of like kind of the circle of mages is kind of framed, and the way that Fringilla's uncle is framed as he's like clearly the head of this entire group, and everyone else is kind of on the margins trying to get their points across. It's a great conflict building between Stregobor and Tissaia, and the consequences of Istrid telling Stregobor in episode 2 about Yen's elven blood finally being paid off in this scene. It's definitely a great scene that kind of orients people that don't really know the world to how mages and sorcerers are the ones that kind of control the power dynamics and the power structure of the continent, and how important it is to have the right mage advising the right ruler. So yeah, I actually really like this scene a lot.
And it also sets up the timeline, because they mention King Fergus of Nilfgaard, who isn't the king in the beginning of the episode when the miners are talking, because they talk about how Fergus was overthrown. Mm-hmm. So this kind of sets up, again, that this is in the far past.
And there's also a mention to Princess Calanfe,
yep.
who, of course, in previous episodes, we know with Ciri's storyline, she is Queen Calanfe in those episodes. So it's another kind of indicator that this is definitely taking place sometime in the distant past.
After learning of Istrid's betrayal, we see the sorcerer initiation ceremony, which is when all of these adepts are then promoted to full sorcerers. Yennefer misses the ceremony because she's desperate to try to prove herself in order to go back to Aedirn. Istrid then finds her in order to apologize, and this ultimately ends up in their fallout. And it's what pushes her to eventually go through with her enchantments on her own, regardless of the Brotherhood and their decision. There's a few things that kind of happen in this argument between Istrid and Yennefer. We establish their romantic relationship and how that's kind of changed over the last, 3-4 years. Suddenly, in this moment of conflict, we see how their individual aspirations are so incompatible to what they're trying to be. Yennefer has aspirations of going to court. She wants to be powerful. She wants to be beautiful. And she feels that this is what she's owed. Istrid, on the other hand, wants to enter research. He doesn't want to go to court. He doesn't care about that aspect of being a mage. These two pieces of their aspiration are what they use in order to hurt each other in this argument.
Yeah, and one thing I really like about this argument is that it's definitely wrong of him to, spy on her, especially when they had such an intimate relationship. But, also, Yennefer was also spying on him. So I think that doesn't completely condemn him since, the character we're following did the exact same thing. It's just that there was more of a consequence on her than there was on him. But I think some of the greatest arguments are, when there really isn't a right to either side. They're fighting because there's just a disconnection and a lack of communication. And they still, really care for each other. They just, can't make their relationship work anymore. So I think that makes this a good argument.
Yeah, and I think just the way this scene is shot, I think just speaks to how Alex Garcia Lopez and his DP, frame not just the action scenes, but also the dialogue scenes, I think in a really interesting way that kind of enhances the storytelling. The argument starts with Istrid holding Yen close. He's kind of framed in this medium shot over the shoulder of Yen, relating what he wants their future to be together. Meanwhile, Yen is kind of framed in this high-angle shot. It's kind of a close-up. And the whole scene turns on the dialogue when she calls being shackled to him basically slow suicide. It's like in any argument, once you say something, even if you don't fully mean it, you can't take it back. And the way that's framed, it kind of lingers on her face for a bit before finally cutting to Istrid, and you kind of feel the impact of that sentence, and you really kind of feel how hurt he is by that. I think both actors play it really well, and I think it's just framed, and shot in a really great way that you kind of feel the emotional hurt that moment really does, and how their relationship is never the same after that moment, and their fates after that moment are kind of defined by this argument in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and this episode really puts both Yennefer and Geralt on equal footing, because Yennefer kind of just lost both of her closest companions, and now she feels like she doesn't really have anyone but herself. Geralt seems like he's in the same situation as well. It's kind of setting up to once they finally meet each other, they're both in a similar situation, and that's why they connect so much, because they're kind of both lost people looking for somebody that cares about them and who won't betray them. So I think that is a very important thing that's setting up for her character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that taking her independence back from Istrid, back from their together plan, is again kind of what informs the next immediate decision that she makes. At the point that she now expects this independence from herself and that she's liberated herself of the expectations that she and Istrid have together, she immediately marches to the quote-unquote artist that is responsible for enchantments, and she demands to go through with them, regardless of the pain, because he's supposed to put her under. So she insists on it in a moment of anger, and there's a number of different consequences for this. First of all, we learn that in order for her to go through these enchantments, such as fixing the deformity in her jaw and her hunchback as well, she has to sacrifice her reproductive organs. This is, again, a callback to what we learned in the previous episode, where we learned that magic has a price, and that price is life source, whether that's from the magician themselves or drawn from some other source. Ultimately, her reproductive organs, her uterus, her tubes, her eggs are removed, burned, and those ashes are used as the material for her transformation. This scene is juxtaposed, as we'll talk about later, with the scene of the Striga's transformation, and Yennefer undergoes her transformation here as well.
One thing I will say about this scene is, I mean, like, if you weren't, like, sold on Anya Chaletra before this episode, I feel like you really were with this scene, because, like, I think it's so impressive what she did. I already really liked her. From, like, the moment I saw her on screen, I thought she was great. But I think this scene is just so, like, crap, what's the word?
Visceral.
Yeah, and, like, man, it's a very simple word. I'm looking for it.
Would raw work?
Raw,
It's animalistic.
It's disturbing.
It's not intimidating. I mean, it is an intimidating scene, but it's so, but, you know, I mean, I think from listening to the official Witcher podcast that they had very few people on set, but it's just so, like, I mean, yeah, she's sitting on a chair and she's, like, naked and she's, like, screaming all the time. It's so vulnerable. That's the word, vulnerable. I found it, people. I think that's what's so impressive about this scene is that she takes such a vulnerable scene from her character and, like, really, like, digs into it. Because I feel like for, like, maybe weaker actors, that would probably be a very hard scene. I mean, I'm assuming this was probably pretty hard for her, but I think she does such a great job with it. I thought it was a very impressive scene because, yeah, it is very vulnerable. And I know if I was in that situation, I would definitely shrink up and, like, probably freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. In the last scene of Yennefer's storyline, Yennefer arrives at the Sorcerer's Ball transformed, earning the attention of King Virfaril of Aedirn and a place in his court. Fringilla sent to Nilfgaard as a direct result. The two decisions that are made in this episode that will ultimately inform her character in later episodes. One, her infertility, which we do hear about in that transformation scene where her reproductive organs are removed. This is a decision that is made in this episode that will then come back in later episodes and inform her character as well. And a decision that later informs the plot is Fringilla ultimately being sent to Nilfgaard in Yennefer's place. Yennefer's push for Aedirn directly impacts the course of Nilfgaardian history, which we then see in series timeline with the future Fringilla.
I really love this scene. I mean, it's even kind of like a callback to, like, when she first goes to that artist and he gives her, like, a dress and stuff, because, like, she probably didn't have very many opportunities when she was younger to, like, dress up, make herself look pretty or anything like that, really. She never really had that opportunity, and so now she, like, takes her own agency and she, like, gets all of that. It's really interesting how Anya Chaletra and how Alex Garcia Lopez frame it because, you know, she opens the door and it's like this very epic moment, but she looks very, like, vulnerable because it's the first time she's, like, standing up straight, you know. Everybody's looking at her like she's the attention of the room. All of this is a first for her and she's, like, it just seems so new to her and it's a really well done scene. Finally, she goes up to the king and she introduces herself. I feel like that's the actual transformation of her character.
Absolutely, when she says Yennefer of Vengerberg.
Yeah, because, like, that's her introducing herself to the world, not just her physical transformation, which I feel like that was a point they were trying to make in the episode, that her value is more coming from her character. Her turning into a new person isn't about her physicality and her looks and her attractiveness. It's more about, like, what she already was.
I mean, we do hear repeatedly in this episode and the episode previously that Yennefer's biggest fear is not being enough, despite her power, despite her beauty, and that no one will ever love her. We hear this in episode 2 when Tissaia tells that to Yennefer to her face as, like, a young student at Aretuza. It's again reiterated here, I believe by Tissaia, but definitely by Istrid as well when they're arguing. And I think, like, her vulnerability immediately after this transformation is part of that, but we'll definitely see how it plays out in later episodes as well.
Yeah, and I think it's just a great reminder is that Anya Chaletra, she's now played someone who's, like, 14, 18, and will play someone that's eventually, like, hundreds of years old or close to 100 years old. And just the fact that she can portray this character so well at all these different ages and time periods, I just think speaks to her remarkable capabilities as an actress. I think this whole scene, also, I agree with you, Mitch, is really well done. And I love how it starts with Istrid noticing that the door is opening, and then it cuts to Saya, and she can tell that something is up. Then we get the reveal of Yennefer. It leads into her dancing with the king, you know, Jilla and her uncle kind of reacting to this really weird, unexpected eruption. It definitely affects her storyline as well. Obviously, Fringilla, her path forward and becoming the advisor for Nilfgaard. It's a really great shot, acted, and edited sequence. And it's a really great culmination of the entire storyline for Yennefer. And also we see visually, I think for the first time, for anyone that hasn't realized it at this point, we visually see that this storyline takes place well into the past because we get a payoff to the portrait where we see young Foltest and Ada next to each other, dressed in the same clothes that they were when the portrait was done. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on in this scene. I think like all the other scenes in this episode, it's really well done.
I really love the point that you made, Rob, about how, how she has to play like multiple versions of the same character. I think like especially like after her transformation versus like before her transformation. Now this might have been like a physical thing because there's something in her mouth. Maybe it was like a big ball of cotton or something to give her the jaw. Her voice is so much different after her transformation, and I think that was a very strong choice by her. Her voice sounds way more full, sounds a little bit deeper, sounds much more mature, and I think it really works, and I think it shows that she is much older. I just think her performance is great.
And as I said, the events of this scene and all of the character development that takes place over the course of this episode really does inform who she is and the decisions that she makes later on the season. But I do think that the close of her time at Aretuza really pushes her forward. The very last scene that we get in the episode is a very brief one with Ciri, where her and Dara wake up in the forest, and Ciri is drawn across a snowy field in a trance, hearing voices coming from the other side in a forest.
It's a good kind of capper on the episode because even up to the very last moments of the episode, we still get this kind of like horror atmosphere. Like that whole sequence felt very reminiscent of The Shining, honestly, with some of the camera angles, and also The Witch, just in terms of a character that's kind of being attracted by this kind of supernatural presence to this dark and mysterious forest. And I mean, the reveal that Dara and Ciri are kind of walking across this battlefield that's full of all these skeletons of presumably dead elves or dead humans. We're not 100% sure, but it's very eerie and very haunting. And I think it's just a great capper to kind of the overall horror atmosphere that's established throughout the entire episode.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the reason they put this scene in is, well, there's probably two reasons. Like, one, they probably didn't want to have an episode without Ciri in it. And two, since this is like serial storytelling, they probably wanted something that would lead into the next episode. So, like, people would continue watching because they kind of put this scene in that asks a lot of questions that aren't answered in this episode. Why is she going that way? Is Dara okay? He just got shot with an arrow. It asks a lot of questions, and you're wondering, like, what's going to happen next? I think that's why they put that scene in.
Yeah, it leaves the episode on a good, foreboding cliffhanger.
A cliffhanger just like this episode of the podcast. Now that we've broken down the plot of the Netflix episode, we're going to pick back up with Mitch and Rob for a thrilling breakdown of the horror themes and the climactic transformation scenes of Betrayer Moon in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Thanks for joining us at the Breakfast Table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and complete lists of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastinbeauclair.com. Breakfast in Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa with the Tidings from Tucson, East Second by Lars from Butcher Flicks. The show is edited by Alyssa with the Breakfast in Beauclair theme by Mojo Filter Media and the Tidings from Tucson theme by Bettina Kempamanas. Breakfast in Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Louise of Covier, the owner of the Trailer's Porpoise, Eric Segalden, Katie the Redhead of Tucson, Jacob B., Julie, Sylvia of Skellige, Jameson, Ava of Gullet, B. Haven of the Edge of the World, Jacob Meeks, Sebastian Bell, Novigrad, Winnie Berg, Glamour, Red Kite, Louis, Like Baton, the Original Roach, Ariel Kitty, 1-2 Chef, and Dustin. Special thanks to Rob P. and Mitch for joining us for this episode, and our international Hanza for their support.